Charlotte closed the classroom door and breathed a sigh of relief. Another day had passed, and she felt both proud of what she had done and exhausted. Being a kindergarten teacher meant going through a variety of emotions and challenges every day. Since she was a child, Charlotte's biggest dream was to become a teacher, and now she had achieved it. As she walked through the school hallways, Charlotte reflected on the activities she had organized that day, wondering if the children had enjoyed the story she had told and thinking that she needed to find more interesting books like that one. She headed to her car, following the same route she had taken for the 6 years since she started working at Sunshine. When Charlotte got home, she discovered that her husband Jason had prepared dinner. Jason, who was still at work, always thought of everything for Charlotte. She smiled when she saw her favorite stew on the stove. As she heated the food, she said to herself, "Ah, Jason, you really know how to cheer me up after a hard day." Although not the most famous chef in El Paso, Jason had a great love for cooking. He always prepared all the meals for both of them, always finding ways to bring peaceful moments to Charlotte. For him, cooking was a way to show love and care, ensuring that Charlotte found joy and comfort in the dishes he prepared with such dedication. Due to their conflicting work schedules, Charlotte was in school during the day and Jason was at the restaurant in the evenings. They had little time together during the week. But they were both saving up to fulfill their dreams of buying a bigger house and having a child. Sitting down at the dining table, Charlotte let her thoughts drift as she enjoyed her dinner. "I need to think of a new way to teach math. Maybe using games. Kids love games," she mused as she slowly savored her meal. After dinner, Charlotte began grading the students' activity books. "Let's see how well you did today," she said as she opened each book, taking detailed notes about each student. "Timothy is improving in his writing, but Anna needs some extra help with math," she noted as she marked the books with stars and encouraging comments. After she finished grading, fatigue set in. Charlotte glanced at the clock and saw that it was still quite a while before Jason got home. Normally she waited for him, but tonight she was so tired that she decided not to get up and instead allowed herself to fall asleep right away. She quickly cleaned up and went to bed, leaving a note for Jason in the kitchen. The next day, Charlotte woke up refreshed and ready for a day full of activities and learning. In the morning, while teaching the children a new song, she was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Dr. Michael Brown, the school principal, accompanied by a young boy. "Charlotte, can I talk to you?" Dr. Brown asked. In the principal's office, Dr. Brown introduced the new student. "This is Brian," he said, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. Brian looked shy, dressed casually and looking down at the ground. "Brian will be joining my class today," Dr. Brown continued. Charlotte knelt down to Brian's eye level and smiled at him. "Welcome, Brian. I'm so happy to have you in our class," she said, trying to convey warmth and welcome. However, Brian only nodded wordlessly. The principal then asked Charlotte to lead Brian into the classroom and introduce him to his classmates. "Of course, Dr. Brown," Charlotte said, holding out her arms for the boy. Brian awkwardly followed her, remaining silent as he entered the classroom. Charlotte noticed the curious looks from the children. "Everyone, we have a new friend in our class," she announced, encouraging Brian to come forward. The children responded with a resounding "Hello, Brian," while he only waved shyly, still adjusting to his new surroundings. The class continued as usual and Charlotte tried to include Brian in the activities. As she walked around the classroom observing the children at work, she noticed Brian's notebook. It was old with worn edges and only a few blank pages. She approached and asked gently, "Brian, do you have a new notebook for the new school year?" Brian looked up at her, his brown eyes reflecting a slight sadness. "This is all I have, ma'am," he replied, his voice soft. Charlotte felt nervous. She knew that proper school supplies were important for a child's learning. Without hesitation, she went to her locker and pulled out a new notebook, still wrapped. Returning to Brian's desk, she placed the notebook in front of him. "Here, Brian, you can use this," she said, smiling encouragingly. Brian looked at the new notebook, his eyes lighting up a little. "Thank you," he whispered almost inaudibly. During recess, Charlotte watched the children playing in the schoolyard. Brian sat alone, isolated from the other children. She approached another teacher and said, "I'm worried about Brian, he's always alone." Anna looked at Brian and said, "It's okay, Charlotte, he's just arrived. You need time to get used to your new friends." However, Charlotte couldn't help but worry. She saw Brian playing with a piece of chalk on the ground. "Maybe I should try to integrate him more," she thought. When recess ended, Charlotte helped the children pack up their things to go back to class. She noticed that Brian was the last to stand up, carefully gathering his things and putting them in his old backpack. She approached him and said, "Brian, you draw really well. Would you like to show your drawings to the class?" Brian seemed surprised by the offer but shook his head and walked towards the door. At the end of the school day, as the children left the classroom in the usual noisy atmosphere, Charlotte stood at a distance watching Brian walk slowly towards the school gate. From a distance, she saw an older man approaching the boy. The man looked older, dressed in simple clothes like Brian. He led the boy to an old car and they both got in. Charlotte sat quietly watching the car roll away, thinking that the man might be Brian's father. When she got home, Charlotte found that Jason had taken the day off. He was in the kitchen preparing something delicious. Seeing Jason, she smiled and he asked, "How was your day, honey?" Charlotte sat on the kitchen counter and began to talk about Brian. "You know, there's a new student in the class. I'm worried about him. He seems so lonely and his things are old. I can't even find a place to write down his notes." Jason, although not the best cook, always listened to her attentively. "It's sad to think that a child doesn't have enough school supplies to learn," he said as he stirred the pot of food. "Do you know who his parents are?" Charlotte shook her head. "Not really. I saw a man take him away today. It looked like he was his father or maybe a relative. He was in a very old car," she continued. "He's very quiet." Jason, today, had given Brian a new notebook because his was almost out of pages. "You should worry more about Brian. You always do the best for your students," he said, placing his hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "Charlotte, I believe you will help Brian open up more over time." As the conversation continued, Charlotte felt a mixture of worry and determination. She knew that with her love and care, she could help Brian feel more comfortable in his new surroundings. However, doubts about his family situation still haunted her mind. Charlotte has always been known as a dedicated teacher who plays an important role in the lives of her students. Brian was no exception. She decided to do her best to understand his situation and provide any help she could. The next day, Charlotte arrived at school earlier than usual, preparing for a new day of work. She watched each child enter the school and noticed that Brian had not arrived yet. When he finally appeared, Charlotte immediately noticed the state of Brian's clothes and fingernails, all of which were dirty. Worry rolled through her as she wondered about his living conditions at home. During recess, when the students ran to get snacks, Charlotte noticed that Brian only took out a crushed piece of bread from his backpack, while the others had a variety of colorful foods. She remembered the bread that Jason had made for her the morning before. Without hesitation, Charlotte took the bread from the bag and walked towards Brian. "Brian, I brought some bread today. Do you want to try it?" Charlotte smiled, handing the bread to the boy. Brian looked at the bread, then at Charlotte, clearly feeling embarrassed and shaking his head in refusal. But Charlotte insisted. "You will definitely like it. It's delicious." After a moment of hesitation, Brian accepted and started eating. The expression on his face clearly showed his hunger. Seeing the opportunity, Charlotte tried to make conversation. "Brian, is the person who brought you home your father or someone else?" she asked gently. Brian lowered his head and whispered, "No, he's my uncle." "I don't know who my father is." The boy's answer made Charlotte feel heavy-hearted, realizing that Brian's life was more complicated than she had imagined. She sat next to him, trying to comfort him. "You can talk to me anytime, Brian. I'm always here to help." Brian just nodded, not saying anything more. Charlotte understood that it would take time to gain Brian's trust. After leaving him with the bread, she headed to the principal's office. Knocking lightly on the door before entering, she found Dr. Michael Brown sitting behind his desk, surrounded by piles of papers. "Dr. Michael Brown, can I talk to you for a moment?" Charlotte asked, closing the door behind her. Dr. Brown looked up over his glasses. "Of course, Charlotte. What's wrong?" Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to muster up the courage to express her concern about the new student, Brian. "I've noticed a few things. He always comes to school in dirty clothes, and today he only had a piece of bread to eat. I'm worried." Dr. Brown sighed and took off his glasses. His uncle registered him. "That man seems normal and has no problems that I know of." "There's nothing to worry about," Charlotte insisted, "but he doesn't look well. His clothes and food are surprisingly good, isn't that right?" The principal shook his head impatiently. "Charlotte, you're exaggerating. This is a personal matter. You should focus on your teaching and not imagine too much." Charlotte felt tired and did not believe Dr. Brown's reaction. She knew he was often selfish and did not really care about his students, but she still hoped he would understand. "As an educator, I feel responsible for the development and learning of my students. If one student is not well, it affects their entire learning process." Dr. Brown raised his hand and said, "Do your job. If there is a real problem, we will deal with it. Now, excuse me, I have a lot of paperwork to sign." Charlotte left the office feeling frustrated and helpless, but she knew she could not ignore what she had seen in Brian. During recess, when the students were playing in the yard, an incident caught Charlotte's attention. Another student, seemingly deliberately provocative, approached Brian and began teasing him with rude words like "you're poor and smelly." Brian was clearly hurt and was about to respond, but Charlotte quickly intervened, gently grabbed his arm and sternly punished him. "Go to the office now and wait there. We'll talk about your behavior later." She looked straight into the provocative child's eyes and realized that he had crossed the line. The student ran trembling towards the principal's office. Charlotte turned to Brian, who was trying to hold back his tears, and gently said, "Don't listen to what he said. You are a very special boy and don't deserve those words." Brian looked down at the ground, tears silently falling. Seeing him so sad, Charlotte had an idea. "Let's go get ice cream. Just you and me." The boy was surprised but hesitant to ask, "What about class?" "Don't worry, I'll have another teacher help the class for the rest of the day. Today is a special day for you," Charlotte explained. After a bit of persuasion, Brian agreed, although he was still a bit skeptical. She led Brian to a nearby ice cream shop, a cute little place with a variety of ice cream flavors on display. "Pick any flavor you want," Charlotte encouraged. Brian chose chocolate ice cream, still a bit shy. Sitting at the table, Charlotte watched Brian eat his ice cream. At first he was shy, but gradually, a genuine smile began to appear on his face. This was the first time Charlotte had seen Brian smile, a small but meaningful step for both of them. After the ice cream trip, Charlotte took Brian back to school. As they entered, Principal Dr. Brown came over immediately and asked, "Charlotte, you went out of school with a student during class? That's unacceptable. Why did you take Brian?" With a slightly worried look, Charlotte explained, "After the incident during recess, Brian was very upset. I just wanted to help him feel better, so we went to get ice cream nearby," hoping that the principal understood her good intentions. Dr. Brown's attitude remained unchanged. "That's not a valid excuse. If his uncle had come to pick him up, he would have been here. I called his uncle to inform him about the incident." Hearing this, Charlotte decided to wait and talk to Brian's uncle to better understand the boy's situation and see if she could help further. While waiting, she observed Brian, who now seemed more relaxed after the short trip outside of school. When Brian's uncle arrived, he seemed calm but his eyes were cold. Brian immediately went to his side, his head bowed as if to hide himself. He looked straight at Charlotte and asked seriously, "What happened here?" Charlotte tried to be clear and kind. "There was an incident today. Brian was provoked by another student." She intervened before the situation escalated. He almost reacted, but she calmed him down. Brian's uncle looked surprised. "Brian doesn't usually react like that. He's a calm boy." He looked at the boy with concern. Charlotte noticed that he looked a little suspicious but listened anyway. Charlotte noticed that Brian's uncle seemed a little suspicious but still answered her questions politely, so she decided to broach another sensitive issue. "I've also noticed that Brian sometimes comes to school with a little dirty clothes and fingernails. I just wanted to know if everything is okay at home," she asked, choosing her words carefully. Brian's uncle replied, slightly annoyed but not hostile, "I'll pay more attention. The house is a little chaotic sometimes." Charlotte continued to raise another concern. "Brian rarely does his homework. I think it might be affecting his studies," she said, hoping that Brian's uncle would realize the importance of the matter. He looked at Brian, who kept his head down, and replied, "I don't really know about that. I'll start checking his notebooks. Thanks for letting me know." Feeling that establishing a direct line of communication would be beneficial, Charlotte suggested, "Can you give me your uncle's phone number?" In case we need to discuss Brian. He hesitated for a moment but finally agreed, "Okay, here's my number. Call if you need me." He wrote the number on a piece of paper and handed it to Charlotte. Charlotte thanked him and watched as her uncle and Brian left. She felt that although her uncle was somewhat evasive, she had succeeded in establishing a line of communication that could be important in understanding and helping Brian. She held the piece of paper with the phone number, thinking about her next steps and how best to approach the situation. When Charlotte arrived home, she found Jason in the kitchen preparing dinner. She sat at the table looking thoughtful. Jason noticed her worried expression and asked, "Are you okay, Charlotte? You seem worried." Charlotte sighed and began to tell him about her conversation with Brian's uncle. "I spoke to Brian's uncle today. He's quite private, not giving much away about their lives and Brian. He rarely looks up when he's around him, which makes me a little nervous." Jason listened intently, only interrupting to ask for more details. "But did you get any useful information? Anything that might help clarify the situation?" Charlotte shook her head. "Not much, but he gave me his phone number. I'll keep an eye on Brian for the next few days and see if I can find out anything." Jason was always supportive of his wife. "You're doing the right thing, Charlotte. It's important to keep an eye on him. Maybe over time, he'll start to open up to you." He paused, thinking before suggesting, "What if we buy Brian a new outfit? That might make him feel more comfortable at school." Charlotte was surprised and touched by the suggestion. "You'll do that? That's great for him. He always wears the same clothes, and I'm sure he'll feel better about coming to school a little cleaner," she said with a grateful smile. Jason replied with a gentle smile, "Of course, I'll pay." "Don't worry about it," Charlotte thanked him, clearly touched by her husband's generosity. The next day, Charlotte arrived at school earlier than usual, carrying a bag of new clothes she had bought for Brian. She stood at the school door, anxiously waiting for him to arrive. When Brian finally appeared, she gently called him over and handed him the bag of clothes. "I brought you something," with a smile. Brian opened the bag and his eyes lit up at the sight of the new clothes, but quickly changed to a worried expression. "What's wrong, Charlotte?" Charlotte noticed the sudden change in his expression and asked, "What's wrong?" "Brian, it's just that my uncle told me not to accept things from others and not to talk about our lives," he replied, looking around as if afraid of being overheard. Charlotte felt a chill rise up at that. "That's strange, Brian. Why would you say something like that?" she asked, trying to make sense of the situation. Brian just shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Charlotte realized that the conversation with the boy's uncle the day before might have triggered this reaction. Even after talking to Brian's uncle, Charlotte noticed that the boy hadn't changed. His hair was messy and his fingernails, although cleaner, still showed signs of neglect. Charlotte's concern increased when in class she noticed that Brian's homework was done in a handwriting that didn't look like his. She gently called Brian over after class and asked, "Brian, who did your homework? The handwriting doesn't look like yours." Brian bowed his head and mumbled something incoherent. Charlotte felt frustrated and worried. "Brian, you can trust me if something happens. I want to help," she said, but the boy remained silent, refusing to talk further about the matter. After her conversation with Brian, Charlotte felt the need to act. She knew it was a risky decision, but she decided to check Brian's file in the principal's office during lunchtime, when the principal was usually gone. She watched furtively as the principal, Dr. Michael Brown, left the school and quickly entered the office. Her heart pounded as she searched for Brian's file. The files were organized by school year and alphabetically, making it easier for her to find them. She finally found Brian's file and began to flip through the files, looking for any information about his family, especially his parents. "My uncle told me not to go out with other people," but Charlotte didn't hesitate to respond warmly. "I understand, Brian, but it's just one night and your uncle knows about it. Everything will be fine, I promise." After a few seconds of hesitation, Brian nodded, clearly still worried about the situation. Charlotte took out her phone and texted Jason. "Jason, Brian is staying with us tonight. Can you fix something nice for dinner? I think he'll like it." When they got home, Brian looked very shy and unsure of how to act. Jason greeted them at the door with a warm smile. "Hi, Brian. Welcome to our house. We're having a special dinner tonight, honey," he said, trying to make the boy feel more comfortable. Brian looked from Jason to Charlotte, clearly still a little uncomfortable, but the friendly atmosphere gradually eased his anxiety. "Do you like grilled chicken?" Jason asked as he led him into the kitchen. Brian nodded shyly, and Jason continued, "Great, I'll make you my special roast chicken." While Jason prepared dinner, Charlotte showed Brian where he would be sleeping and gave him a clean set of clothes she had bought on the way home. "I bought these for you, Brian. Hope they're comfortable." Brian still shyly thanked her softly. After dinner, Charlotte led Brian into the living room to change. She noticed through the slightly open door that Brian seemed thinner than before and that his old shoes looked like they had been through many days. "You'll feel right at home, there's no reason to be afraid here," Charlotte tried to convey reassurance. Brian, now dressed in clean and more comfortable clothes, looked at Charlotte. "Your uncle won't like seeing you here. He'll be upset with you." His voice trembled with fear. Charlotte crouched down to Brian's level. "I'm here to protect you, Brian. Nothing bad will happen." She tried to comfort him, but the boy still felt worried. Charlotte gently asked Brian, "Is there something bothering you at home?" "I can help, however." Brian shook his head. "I can't talk about it, teacher. I promised Uncle I wouldn't." "You can go to sleep now, okay?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Charlotte felt her heart tighten at that. "Of course, Brian. I'll leave the door open if you need anything. Just call me," she said, trying to smile as she left the room. When she reached the living room, Charlotte shared her observations and concerns with Jason. "Jason, it seems like something very serious is going on with Brian at your house. I need to do something. I can't just leave it alone." The determination in her voice was clear. Jason looked at her with a supportive gaze. "I will find a way to help him, Charlotte. We will do this together." Charlotte woke up before dawn, full of determination and anxiety. She went into the kitchen and started preparing a full breakfast, thinking about Brian. When she put the meal on the table, she called softly, "Brian, breakfast is ready." Jason also joined the kitchen, trying to create a relaxing atmosphere as they ate breakfast. Jason tried to chat with Brian. "Brian, tell me more about your family." Brian, however, felt uncomfortable and replied cautiously, "I can't talk about that." At this time, Brian looked at the bread on the table and shyly asked, "Can I bring a bread home? I'm always hungry and sometimes don't have much food." Hearing this, Charlotte felt a pain in her heart. "Of course, Brian. I will prepare a delicious snack for you to take home." She tried to smile to hide her anxiety. While Charlotte prepared the snacks, Brian watched her with a focused gaze. He whispered almost inaudibly, "It must be nice to have a family that cares for you like that." Those words touched Charlotte and Jason's hearts. They exchanged emotional glances. Jason tried to keep his voice steady. "You know, Brian, families can be made in many different ways. The important thing is that there are always people who care about you." Charlotte nodded and added, "And you will always have people who care about you, Brian." Brian looked at them with warm eyes, as if sensing their sincerity. As soon as they finished their meal, Charlotte led Brian to school, feeling a mixture of worry and concern. During class, she tried to concentrate on the lesson, but her mind was always on the end of the day, when she would have a chance to talk to Ronald, Brian's uncle, to get a better understanding of his situation. In the afternoon, Charlotte's anxiety increased as she kept an eye on every car arriving at school, expecting Ronald to appear. As Brian played alone with a more gloomy expression than usual, Charlotte approached Brian. "I see you're not well. Is there something worrying you?" Before Brian could reply, a car stopped right in front of the school. Ronald got out and asked Brian about his day. Then he turned to Charlotte with a cold smile. "Thank you for taking care of him, but I'll have to transfer Brian to another school." Upon hearing this, Brian reacted immediately. His eyes filled with tears and he rushed towards Charlotte, hugging her tightly. "Teacher, don't let him take me away. I don't want to go." Charlotte felt her heart tighten when she saw Brian's despair. Ronald looked surprised by Brian's reaction and took a step towards the boy, but Charlotte quickly intervened. "Ronald, what's going on? Why do you want to transfer Brian to another school so suddenly?" Her voice was strong, despite the emotional turmoil around her. Brian continued to hug Charlotte, crying uncontrollably. Ronald hesitated, seemingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sorry, teacher, but this is none of your business. I know what's best for the boy." "No, Ronald, you need to understand why I did this," Charlotte replied firmly. Ronald refused to explain further, just told Brian to get in the car quickly. "Let's go, Brian. There's no time to discuss." The boy still hugged Charlotte, screaming in tears, but Ronald got in the car and drove away. Charlotte stood there, unable to move, watching the car speed away with anger and despair. Unable to stand still, Charlotte decided to follow them. She ran to her car and drove quickly after them. While driving, Charlotte tried to stay calm. "I have to find a way to help Brian. This can't continue." She remembered her promise to Jason and was determined not to give up. On the way, Charlotte constantly thought about how to approach Brian to get out of the predicament he was facing at his uncle's house. Charlotte's heart was pounding. She sensed something was wrong. What was this man hiding? She wondered as she kept a safe distance from Ronald's car. Charlotte knew she needed to be discreet to avoid being noticed. She considered calling the police but hesitated. If I interfere, things might get worse for Brian. She worried about what Ronald was capable of. Charlotte decided to continue following Ronald alone to find out more. First, she needed to figure out where they were going. She continued to drive behind Ronald through the streets, her mind focused but her heart heavy with worry. "I will find out the truth, Brian. I will keep you safe," she promised herself, determined to do whatever it took to protect her student. She stepped on the gas harder, trying to keep Ronald in sight. Ronald drove recklessly, accelerating and turning sharply. Charlotte knew she had to keep her distance, but she couldn't lose sight of Ronald. What is he trying to hide? Why is he driving so fast, she wondered, her heart pounding as she pursued the increasingly remote roads out of the city. The situation became even stranger when Ronald seemed to be heading toward a remote area, which only added to the sense of urgency and danger. In a moment of calm, as Charlotte stopped at a red light, she quickly grabbed her phone and called Jason. "Jason, I'm following Uncle Brian. He's driving fast and we're getting away from the city." Her voice was shaking with tension. Jason replied in a worried tone, "Charlotte, this is dangerous. We need to turn back now. We don't know what this man is capable of." Charlotte, however, was adamant. "I can't turn back now, Jason. I need to save this boy. I'll keep watching. I've sent you my location." Jason, feeling scared but also admiring Charlotte's courage, replied, "I'll come to you, but I'm a long way away. It'll take me a while to get there." When the light turned green, Charlotte resumed her pursuit. She knew she was putting herself in danger, but her concern for Brian and her desire to protect him outweighed any hesitation. She drove carefully but steadily, following Ronald's every move. With each passing mile, the tension grew, but Charlotte did not give up. Ronald had now turned onto a dirt road that led through dense forest. She kept a safe distance to avoid making any noise that might attract attention. The road led to a deserted area, and Charlotte felt a pang of dread at the thought of what she might find there. Finally, Ronald's car stopped beside a makeshift cottage, surrounded by tall weeds and scattered trash. Charlotte parked the car a short distance away and quietly made her way toward the cottage. She needed to see what was going on inside, but knew she had to be extremely careful as she approached. Charlotte found a small window to peer inside. The view through the window shocked her. The place was dirty and abandoned, with an old mattress covered in stains on the floor. Brian was sitting on the mattress, clearly in shock. Ronald was talking to the boy, his voice sounding harsh and impatient. "Brian, this has to be done. You'll understand," Ronald said as Brian choked up. "Please don't let me take you away from school. You like it there. I like being your teacher." Charlotte watched the scene from the shadows, feeling both anger and pity. She knew she needed evidence to report the situation privately. She took out her phone and began recording what she was seeing through the window. The images were shocking but necessary as proof for Charlotte. As she turned to leave, her foot accidentally brushing against a plastic bottle hidden in the tall weeds. The sound of the plastic bottle being crushed shattered the silence of the place, creating a loud noise that echoed in the still evening. She stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. Immediately, the door of the cottage burst open and Ronald appeared, his eyes filled with surprise and horror as he saw Charlotte. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a mixture of shock and fear, approaching her, clearly distraught at having been discovered. Meanwhile, Brian heard the noise and his uncle's voice running out of the cottage towards Charlotte. "The teachers came to save you," he exclaimed, his voice shaking with hope and fear. Charlotte, still trying to process the situation, turned to Ronald. "Please calm down. I just came because I was worried about Brian. I don't intend to do anything. I just want to understand what's going on." She tried to keep her tone calm. Ronald paused for a moment, looking between Charlotte and Brian. "I'm not a bad person. You've got it all wrong," he said quickly, his voice low but firm. Charlotte was still confused, taking a deep breath to gain clarity. "Please explain why this is the case." The atmosphere became tense as Ronald seemed to wrestle with what he was going to say. "It's complicated," he began. "It's not what you think." Charlotte sensed the complexity of the situation and knew she needed to listen to Ronald to understand the situation with Brian. As Ronald hesitantly began his explanation, Charlotte looked to Brian, who was hugging her for comfort. She put her arms around the boy, silently reassuring him that everything would be okay. Ronald gestured with his hand to invite Charlotte into the cottage. "Come in. I'll explain everything." Charlotte felt uncertain, but with her concern for Brian, she decided to enter. The cottage smelled musty, the light from an oil lamp was dim, creating a gloomy atmosphere. Ronald led her to a corner where Brian was still sitting, looking at her with eyes full of fear and hope. Ronald said in a tone that was both frustrated and urgent, "Charlotte, although you don't trust me, you came here when I called you." Despite her doubts, Charlotte decided to enter the house that Ronald called his home. The space inside was stuffy with a foul smell, a clear chaos due to the accumulation of garbage, especially the plastic bottles scattered everywhere. Ronald sat down on a chair, looked around the rough house, then turned to Charlotte. "Brian, go to your room." A commanding but authoritative voice. The boy obeyed, disappearing into the only room in the house. That room, in contrast to the rest of the house, looked a bit more cared for. A good mattress in fairly stable condition and a few toys scattered on the floor made for a small but cozy space. Ronald began to tell his story to Charlotte, who listened attentively. "It's a long story," he began, seeming to consider each word. "My sister Brian's mother passed away last year. She had a serious illness and had to raise Brian alone. Brian's father, her old friend, was a terrible and dangerous man." Ronald took a deep breath before continuing his story, his face looking as if he was reliving every painful moment. "My sister and Brian's father's relationship was always full of trouble, many problems. It gradually got worse and she decided to divorce. That's when she found out she was pregnant with Brian," he explained, his eyes looking down at the floor. "After Brian was born, my brother, who used to be her best friend, started threatening her. She did everything to protect him, to keep him from knowing the truth about his father. She never told Brian who his father was to avoid hurting him." Ronald paused for a moment, his voice choked with emotion. "The problem is that you are very poor, like me. But it's worse for me. I make a living by scavenging for trash, so all these plastic bottles are collected by me. When you died, there was no one but me to take care of Brian. I didn't have an education, but I knew I had to protect him." He took a deep breath before continuing. "When Brian's father found out about your death, he decided he wanted the boy back. He was an evil man and God only knows what he would do to my nephew. I couldn't let that happen, so I decided to run away with Brian." Ronald looked straight into Charlotte's eyes, his eyes a mixture of fear and determination. "We used the old car my sister had bought with great difficulty. We found an abandoned house. It was the most remote and isolated place I could find to hide. Everything I did was to protect Brian." A heavy sigh escaped their lips. Charlotte asked, her voice filled with concern, "But why did you decide to withdraw Brian from school?" Ronald sighed before answering. "Living in hiding like we did, I was always afraid of being discovered. I don't have formal custody of Brian and I realized that he was forming strong relationships with his friends at school. This could be dangerous if someone decided to look for his biological father. They could find us." Fear was evident in his eyes. "I sent him to school despite the risk because I knew that studying was important to him, to get an education. But now with the increasing risk, I don't know what to do anymore." Ronald's voice trembled a little. Charlotte felt worried and asked about Brian's food. "Is Brian eating enough?" Ronald bowed his head before answering. "Every day when Brian went to school, I collected and sold recyclable materials. The money I earned was just enough to cover basic needs. I bought food for Brian, but often I had to go without so he could have enough. I bought a new mattress for him with the little money I had, and I slept on the old one in the corner." Charlotte realized Ronald's great sacrifice and felt a wave of emotion. "You did all this by yourself," she said, her voice choking. Ronald looked at her, his eyes reflecting exhaustion and determination. "I would do anything to keep Brian safe and happy. He is all I have at that moment." Charlotte knew what she needed to do to help. Ronald continued, "Brian doesn't understand the whole situation. I asked him not to tell anyone about our life to avoid being discovered, but he doesn't like living like that. He's always crying, begging to go to a better place, wanting to play, to be a normal kid. I try to do what I can but feel helpless because I can't give him more." Ronald's voice was choked with emotion. Charlotte felt a wave of empathy and determination. "I'll help you," she said firmly. She took out her phone and quickly called Jason, explaining the whole situation in a few words. "I'm sending you the location right now." She quickly hung up. Jason, on the other hand, replied, "Got it." "Oh my God, this is a really bad situation. I'll be right there. I'll call a lawyer friend and see what we can do." When Jason arrived at the abandoned house, he couldn't believe the situation either. "This is unbelievable," he said as he looked around. "You can't stay here. Come to our house." Charlotte and Ronald looked into each other's eyes, realizing that they had no choice but to seek help. Jason quickly arranged everything, contacted his lawyer friend, and began to make plans to move Brian to a safer place. They know that time is not on their side, and every passing minute could bring new danger. While they were trying to figure out a solution, Jason explained that he had a lawyer friend who could help with Brian's situation. Ronald hesitated, clearly conflicted between his gratitude for the offer and his fear that this might reveal more information about himself and Brian. "I don't know, this could get you into trouble again," he said, looking worried. Jason insisted, however, "We can't leave you in this situation. With the help of a lawyer, we can find a legal solution to everything." After a moment of silence, Ronald finally nodded. "Okay," he said, a sigh of relief escaping him. "Thank you guys." "I don't know how to thank you." At Charlotte and Jason's house, Ronald and Brian tried to settle into their new life. Charlotte prepared clean clothes for Brian, who looked happy and relieved in the warm atmosphere. They sat down to dinner together, and Brian and Ronald, after a long time, were finally able to enjoy a nutritious and delicious meal. In the following days, Jason contacted his lawyer friend, who quickly got to work on the case. The lawyer conducted a thorough investigation and discovered that Brian's father was a fugitive, having committed many crimes including theft. Based on the evidence gathered in Ronald's testimony about his sister and the hardships she endured after her divorce from her ex-husband, the lawyer built a strong case for the court. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge decided that Ronald, as the closest relative and showing genuine concern for Brian's welfare, should be awarded custody of the boy. When Ronald received this news at Charlotte and Jason's house, he could not contain his emotions and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You saved my nephew's life and my life." As they celebrated the good news together, the phone rang. It was the lawyer with another update. Brian's father had been arrested in a police raid this morning. Jason shared the good news excitedly, while Ronald could hardly believe that the nightmare was over. With all the paperwork taken care of, Charlotte and Jason had another surprise for Ronald. They handed him an envelope containing a large sum of money they had saved for their new home, but they thought he needed it more. "We put half of our savings in here," Jason explained as he handed the envelope to Ronald. "This should help you start over, find a place to live, buy clothes and food. We can recover." Ronald looked at the envelope in surprise. "I don't know what to say, this is really generous," he stammered, surprised by their kindness. Charlotte smiled and added, "And what's more, Jason has a position as a waiter at the restaurant where he works. They pay well and he's willing to teach you everything you need to know." Ronald, still in a state of shock, nodded. "I never imagined I would receive so much help. How can I thank you?" Jason smiled warmly. "Just accept it, Ronald. You deserve a new chance and we're happy to help." Brian, who had witnessed everything, ran over to Charlotte and Jason, hugging them. "I won't have to drop out of school, and we'll have a place to stay. I can play with my friends," the boy said excitedly. He turned to Ronald. "Uncle, we'll be okay, right?" Ronald hugged Brian, tears of relief and happiness streaming down his cheeks. "Yes, we will be fine, Brian," he replied with emotion in his voice. Brian looked at Charlotte and Jason and said, "I learned in school what family is, and family is where there is love and care. Thank you for being my family." Brian's simple yet profound words touched the hearts of everyone in the room. Charlotte and Jason hugged Ronald and Brian, knowing that they had made a difference in their lives. Together they formed a new kind of family, bound by love, compassion, and gratitude. If this story has touched your heart, I encourage you to show your appreciation by liking and subscribing to our channel to join the community. Your support is what drives us to continue bringing interesting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing stories we are about to release on your screen. We appreciate your support. See you soon.